In 1959, when I was 8, my parents, musician Tony Romano and actress Barbara Hayden, divorced, and my mother married Jesse L. Lasky Jr. Knowing this situation was difficult for a young boy, Jesse sat me down quietly and said, "I know this is tough for you, and it's natural that you should love and miss your father. And I understand that you would feel uncomfortable living with a stranger. But all I ask is this. Don't judge me because I'm not your father. Judge me by how I treat you." Following his request, I learned that Jesse was a kind and generous stepfather who made me laugh every day with his use of language. A scholar of history and literature, a cartoonist, novelist, screenwriter, and a gifted poet, he inspired me with the magic and power of words. I introduced him to Bob Dylan, and he showed me where Bob got his stuff, introducing me to Dylan Thomas and T.S. Eliot. Born in 1910, Jesse had an old world view. He explained that manners were not simply useless rules of behavior invented to instill conformity, but a way of making life more gentle and a little less dog-eat-dog. Things like place settings at a table and how to hold a knife and fork were developed out of practicality. Opening doors for others was simply being generous. If I got into an argument, he asked me to consider that the only choice for a cornered tiger is to attack. Always leave them a doorway to escape. He helped me to develop respect for those who deserved respect. In short, he taught me, by example, to be a gentleman. Perhaps most of all, he was a spellbinding storyteller. We often had glittering dinner parties at our London flat at 57 Green Street, full of actors, writers, and directors. The wittiest person I have ever known, Jesse regularly entertained the guests with fascinating stories of his amazing life in Hollywood. He held the room with superb timing, mimicking the voices and facial expressions of colleagues such as Cecil B. DeMille and Gary Cooper. His performances became legendary, and many said he should have been an actor. But it would be more accurate to say he could have been a stand-up comic, a TV host, or talk show guest. Through the years, everyone urged him to write down all these wonderful stories and turn them into a book. We eventually nagged him into doing it, and finally, Whatever Happened to Hollywood was published in 1973. Out of print, and the original publisher gone the way of the dodo, I decided to republish this new edition with rare new photographs, colorized to bring life to the unique world Jesse grew up and worked in. A Hollywood that is gone forever and likely to be utterly alien to the contemporary reader. The story of the Lasky family is both the history of the film industry and the birth of the art form, an important part of our collective cultural heritage. But, as Jesse's sister, film historian Bessie Lasky, lamented, Jesse Lasky was co-founder of Paramount, but now he's a forgotten film mogul. To right that wrong, and to put this book into context, I offer some background. Who were these two Jessies? Jesse Louis Lasky, 1880 to 1958, was Hollywood's earliest and most visionary film pioneer. Choosing Cecil Blount DeMille as a first-time director and his brother-in-law Samuel Goldfish, later Goldwyn, as a partner, the Jesse L. Lasky Feature Play Company, 1911, produced the first full-length film in Hollywood, The Squaw Man, 1913. Lasky was not a typical mogul in many ways. An educated, soft-spoken, refined man, he dressed fastidiously and wore a gold pince-nez. Lasky was the only studio head to have been of second-generation Californian. His great-uncle had been a court musician to a Prussian king. His grandfather was a pioneer, crossing America in a covered wagon to settle in San Francisco. His personality was a mixture of dreamer, businessman, gambler, and showman, and the dreamer seems to have always been dominant. As Adolf Zucker said, "He's a wonderful man, but he's almost too nice. He would never hurt anyone. He's a gentleman." He began his career in vaudeville as a cornet player in a duo with his sister Blanche, and music was always close to his heart. In the often coarse, profit-oriented showbiz community, Lasky was a sophisticated enthusiast who was excited by the artistic potential of the new medium of motion pictures to tell compelling stories. Although he enjoyed the hotels, fast cars, and even faster women of his time, he was an elegant man whose excesses were always in service to the art of filmmaking he helped develop. Vaudeville was the prime theatrical entertainment of the 1900s. It featured a variety of specialty acts, comedy, song, and dance. Lasky became a successful vaudeville producer with companies touring the U.S. He also produced 2 Broadway musicals, Hello Paris and A la Broadway. His brother-in-law, Sam, got him interested in the flickers, pictures that moved with flickering lights. The Famous Players Lasky Corporation was founded when the Jesse L. Lasky Feature Play Company merged with Adolf Zucker's Famous Players Film Company and Paramount Distribution in 1916. They became the Paramount Famous Lasky Corporation when they purchased the Robert Brunton Studios at 5451 Marathon Street in Hollywood in 1927. They then became Paramount Pictures, the first major Hollywood film studio. Lasky produced over 1,000 films and discovered, and sometimes named, many stars, including Maurice Chevalier, Rudolph Valentino, Gary Cooper, Clara Bow, Spencer Tracy, and Joan Fontaine. He amassed a fortune estimated at $20 million, only to lose it all in the Wall Street crash. He was sabotaged by his personal assistant and ousted from Paramount. Ever resilient, he came back, an independent producer for Warner Brothers, thanks to the only Hollywood friend who stood by him, Jack Warner. He continued to make many outstanding pictures, including Sergeant York, The Adventures of Mark Twain, and Rhapsody in Blue. Lasky's personal relationships with his fellow moguls is fascinating. They seem to genuinely respect his endless creativity and fearless optimism that energized his productions. The art was always more important to Lasky than the money. He wrote, "Do things you believe in and keep believing in them even when the going gets tough." But in some ways, perhaps the other studio heads also resented him. They all came up together, with Lasky as their leader, mentor, and friend. But now that each had created their own empires with armies of sycophants, they wanted to believe their own press. They didn't want to be around people who knew them when, especially the man who had started many of their careers. And yet this possible resentment seemed to coexist with genuine friendship. Family was very important to Lasky, and he spent what time with them his incredibly hectic schedule would allow, constantly traveling to business meetings to raise finance, and to Europe to discover stars like Archie Leach, Cary Grant, and Maurice Chevalier. His wife Bessie had studied to be a concert pianist, and became an acclaimed painter and poet, her paintings often exhibited. She was an ethereal presence who avoided Hollywood types, instead serving as hostess to many writers, poets, musicians, and painters in their 30-room Santa Monica beach house. Jesse Louis Lasky Jr., 1910 to 1988, was Lasky's eldest son. About 10 years older than his brother Bill and sister Betty, Jesse experienced the early days of Hollywood firsthand, growing up in a mansion with 27 servants and 5 Rolls-Royces in the garage. They were a very close and loving family, as can be seen by the many pictures in this book. Here is a rare opportunity to see Hollywood from the point of view of a child who grew up playing with tin soldiers in its dusty streets, racing carts with young Doug, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and accompanying his father on his dangerous trips to faraway places. He was short because of a bout of polio as a child, cured by rigorous tennis, swimming, and horseback riding, activities he enjoyed throughout his life with friends such as Anthony Quinn, Paul Henreid, and director Charles Schneer. Jesse went to the finest schools, his father encouraging him to explore the worlds of literature, art, and music, and filmmaking, which would encompass all 3. While ill and spending so much time resting in bed, he exercised his mind by writing. His career began at 16 when, without his father's help, he published 3 well-received books of poetry, Songs from the Heart of a Boy, Listening in Silence, and Singing in Thunder. Jesse went to Blair Academy, Princeton, and was attending the University of Dijon in France when his father's bankruptcy meant Jesse had to come home and find work in California as a lowly reader for the low-budget Fox studio. During World War II, he served as a captain commanding combat photographic units of the Signal Corps in 4 campaigns in the South Pacific, and was decorated by General MacArthur. He organized the Army School of Film Training at the Signal Corps Photographic Center, where writers were instructed to script training films for the entire military service. Jesse's diary notes, "Reported for duty as second lieutenant at the Barrage Balloon School. The barracks were cozy and homelike as an unfinished coffin. One of my roommates was studying to be a mess officer, the other to be a mess. They both achieved their goals." While training, Jesse made friends with Lieutenant Roger Amio, who rigged me for tennis in his wife's blouse, his shoes, and bathing trunks of unknown origin. He wore moccasins. Note how the toes curled. We got a hot doubles match with a 12-year-old and his grandfather, and we lost. Jesse describes the post-war struggles of finding work in Hollywood, beginning as a co-writer of potboiler novels. He eventually began working with his father's partner, writing 8 films for DeMille, including Samson and Delilah, for which he received the Box Office Award, and The 10 Commandments, for which he received the Christopher Award. Jesse's unique relationship with DeMille is a feature of this book. It began in his childhood, knowing DeMille as his father's friend and partner, and developed into a professional collaboration as an adult that mixed exhaustion, fear, and emotional torture with a deep mutual respect. Jesse suffered the tyranny of his rages, the sting of his insults, and yet could still be surprised by his occasional kindnesses. In a world that views DeMille's films as hopelessly outdated, Jesse mounts a surprising defense for the simple values that made them so successful. The 10 Commandments is one of the biggest box office hits of all time. As a poet and observer of the subtle hues and shadings of existence, Jesse could also appreciate the need for the primary colors of DeMille's work. In all, he wrote screenplays for 37 films, 4 with my mother. From the 1950s, he wrote many scripts for TV in Hollywood. When my mother began co-writing with Jesse on cop shows in the late 1950s, The Naked City and The New Breed, she had to change her professional name to Pat Silver. A woman writing a police drama was simply not acceptable in those less liberated times. Brought to London in 1962 by a slick German conman, producer, Jesse and my mother, left high, dry, and broke, decided to stay, working on classic British TV series such as Danger Man, The Avengers, and The Saint. I learned ideal work habits for any artist by watching Jesse and my mother work to a schedule. Breakfast, 3 hours at the typewriter. Lunch, 3 hours at the typewriter. Dinner. In those days before computers, I would proofread their work. Great writers, but they really couldn't spell. I am so happy for you, dear reader, to have the opportunity to experience Jesse's unique personality. He tells his Hollywood tales joyously, as a knowing insider, with stories and insights that sizzle with the heat of first-hand observation. His use of language is that of the poet, and it is well worth reading slowly to savor his metaphors, similes, allusions, and jokes. Even when he writes about a period of his career where he had to churn out hack formulaic crap, he writes about it with self-deprecating style. My work was going from bad to positively mediocre. He passionately describes Hollywood's ambivalent climate of sin and sanctity, public morality, and private license that ruined many careers and lives, some the lives of his friends. But on every page we see a wry smile that sees the humor as well as the tragedy. Whatever happened to Hollywood is more than a dry history written by a researcher or superficial glamour from a fan more concerned with the costumes than the creative, desperate, crazy people wearing them. Jesse describes Hollywood as it gasped for the oxygen of hope and breathed the fire of greed in the great mousetrap for dreamers, madmen, prophets, and fools. And he writes tellingly of old Hollywood's demise at the hands of television in the 1950s and 60s. He once told me, "The show doesn't necessarily go on, you know. Sometimes it just stops." It's easy to look at the past through contemporary eyes, laughing at odd customs from the lofty heights of a more evolved time, as one might when watching a costume drama. But Jesse not only tells you whatever happened to Hollywood, but also what happened to him. He lets you feel his emotions, and thereby the emotions felt by people of the time, sharing their dreams, their frustrations, and frame of reference. It was a world where people regularly communicated by writing letters, even if they were in the same town. Jesse and his father were very close. Though Lasky Sr. was always traveling, he kept in touch with his son through weekly letters from the time he was 10. My mother, Pat Silver Lasky, explores these letters in Hollywood Royalty, A Family in Films, to provide a rare look into the birth of Hollywood, the creative process, and the nuts and bolts of film production. Jesse's relationship with his father is another feature of this book, a mixture of profound love and underlying apprehension. In an interview for the original launch, he told a story explaining, "I didn't put it in the book. It seemed too intimately involved with my feelings. You see, at 18, I had no idea of going into films. I didn't want to. I was worried by the terrible flamboyance, exaggeration, gambling, and throwing about of large sums of money. Just before I went to university, I was riding to the studio with my father in one of our Rolls-Royces. He agreed with me that a good career might be as a diplomat. I asked him how rich we were, and he said, 'As rich as we needed to be, and we'd be richer.' He told me, 'I'm going to retire in a couple of years, and I've put $1 million in the name of each of you children.' I asked, 'Put it? How have you put it?' He said, 'Why, in stock. You each have $1 million in stock.' Dad, do me a favor. Take $200,000 from each of our stock and put the money in a trust that nobody can touch, not even us.' 'You coward,' he said. 'You ridiculous coward. That's your mother talking through you again. What do you want to do? Go down and collect a few dollars once a month? With stock, you'll make more money than I ever dreamed of.' Shortly after that, the stock market crashed, and the Laskys lost $14 million, their cars, and their home. Jesse had to look for work. Our recent past is a very different world, an alien culture to today's readers. Strict segregation was not only a fact of American law, but it was the policy of the armed forces. Jewish soldiers were often made captains of black American battalions. Pre-liberation, the subordinate position of women was unquestioned by all but a very few, such as Marlene Dietrich. The word sir was used by sons, daughters, students, and professional employees such as waiters, shopkeepers, and screenwriters. There was a commonly shared moral compass that will be downright extraterrestrial to readers in the 21st century, a time when it seems that right and wrong have become what anyone says they are. The traditional virtues of apple pie, flag-waving patriotism were the accepted norm. The educated knew it was hokum, but the reassuring, simple, homespun morality expressed in movies was the very reason ordinary American audiences bought their tickets at the box office. And Jesse's employer, C.B. DeMille, narcissistic tyrant, extravagant showman, and blockbuster director, was all about box office. And for those interested in the craft of screenwriting, it was a pre-computer world where without an Underwood typewriter, an army of secretaries to retype, and a mimeograph machine to churn out copies, scripts could not be written, revised, or used by a production company, and films could not be made without scripts detailing every word, shot, and angle. With a discerning eye and a wicked sense of humor, Jesse takes you to this world as only an insider can. Here you will see the inner workings of the glory days of Hollywood, the icy cruelty, the breathtaking creativity, and the destructive treachery. Removed as we are from this 20th century culture, we may still recognize our own and agree with Jesse when he writes that the world kept changing, yet some patterns remained the same. You want to feel how it felt to learn that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor? You want to know what it was like to date Jean Harlow? Would you like to sit on the Via Veneto with a slippery producer and a strong espresso, watching how Hollywood migrated to Europe at the birth of the international film scene? You like the idea of having meetings with formidable producers like Harry Cohn, Daryll Zanuck, and the man they called God, Cecil B. DeMille? Keep listening. You can dress for dinner and have your chauffeur drive you to a ritzy nightclub where you can sip correctly chilled champagne, down a few oysters, and see Hollywood's glamorous glitterati sitting right next to you, cracking jokes, sharing secrets, and telling lies. Or imagine yourself sitting in our Mayfair London living room in the 1970s, drink in hand, surrounded by amazing friends, being entertained by Jesse's stories of his own journey through a fabled land populated by dreamers and accountants, conmen and marks, sparkling talents and successful idiots, the hopeful and the hopeless, all told with his mastery of language, his depth of feeling, his sparkling wit, and his inherent kindness. Jesse was a man with an explosive imagination. But he didn't need that particular gift to tell these stories. He was there. Radio,